writer of the paper, An Economic Recovery Program for a Post-Bubble Economy. Please give a round of applause for my colleague, Sherle Schwenninger, who, along with Mike Lynn, conceived this outstanding program today.
After following Steve, one always has to lower the mic. He's known as the tall man. When the tall man stands up, you're supposed to pay attention. So my duty in this session is to introduce, I think, what will be a culminating discussion in terms of the first three panels before we go to the keynote lunch. And it's intended to further deepen the search for solutions that we began in the first two sessions. If I could remind you quickly, Joe Gagnon, I think, made some very good, important points about macroeconomic policy, fiscal and monetary policy being the front line of defense. We heard from the governor and the congresswoman about the importance of the fiscal stimulus and particularly the infrastructure components of it, of being able to create jobs and address both the short-term and long-term structural job deficit in the future. We heard the importance of addressing issues related to trade, competition, human capital, and Leo Hendry made some important points about the importance of corporate tax reform and providing additional tax incentives for companies to be able to invest and grow job creation in the United States. Now we're going to carry on and deepen those and add a few other new ideas. And let me introduce the speakers in the order of which they will be speaking. First, Timothy Bartik, to my immediate left, who is a senior economist of the W.E. Upjohn Institute for Employment Research. And he has just today released a very important paper on tax credits, which he will describe and go into some detail. Next to him is Janet Kavinoky, who's the Director of Transportation and Infrastructure with the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. And next to her is Thea Lee, who is or was the Policy Director and Chief Economist at the AFL-CIO. I think you have a new job title, is that correct? Thea has just recently become Deputy Chief of Staff at the AFL-CIO. And next to her is Michael Mandel, the Chief Economist of BusinessWeek, and I think one of the most incisive economic columnists that we have in our nation today. Michael Lynn, finally, is the Policy Director at the Economic Growth Program at the New America Foundation. I've given each of the panelists 8 minutes to lay out their ideas, and then we'll have approximately 25, 30 minutes for Q&A before we hear from Jared Bernstein. Timothy, you're up first.
Thank you. First, I'm going to run through some numbers, and I just want to point out that the numbers I'm running through, somewhere buried in your packet is a little handout labeled Targeted Job Creation Policies Can Create Needed Jobs in 2010 and 2011 at relatively modest cost per job created. So the numbers are in there. Let me at the outset say some of the things I'm not going to discuss, even though I think they're important. First of all, I'm focusing on the short-term job creation issue, not the structural issues. Not that those aren't important. I've written about long-term economic development. I've written some recent papers on early childhood education as economic development. That's very important. But I'm not going to focus on that today. Second, the fact that I advocate these two particular policies doesn't mean I don't think other fiscal stimulus should be attempted. I think it clearly doesn't make sense to be laying off school teachers and shutting down pre-K programs in the middle of a recession, and we need to think about ways to prevent things like that from happening, as well as investing in infrastructure. But let me talk about the two policies I want to add to the policy discussion today. The first is this idea of a job creation tax credit. John Bishop of Cornell and I have a paper that's being released today by the Economic Policy Institute. You can get a lengthy paper with appendices and spreadsheets and all kinds of things at the EPI website. What is the job creation tax credit? First of all, it's a revised version of something we did in 1977 and 78 called the New Jobs Tax Credit. It's revised from that. It's somewhat different, but it's similar. Here's the basic concept. The federal government would provide a refundable 15% wage credit to all employers for additions to payroll that occurred in 2010 and a 10% credit for additions to employment in 2011. Those additions would be measured relative to a base period of the fourth quarter of 2008 through the third quarter of 2009. As I said, this is somewhat different. It's similar to the 77, 78 New Jobs Tax Credit. It differs particularly that the credit is refundable and payable on a quarterly basis. The 77, 78 credit was only applicable to for-profit corporate businesses. It was limited to the amount of your corporate income tax liability. This one would apply to unprofitable businesses. They could get money from this. It would apply to nonprofit organizations. They could get money from this. It could apply to state and local governments. Anyone who adds to payroll would get this. So the question is what impact this would have. In the paper we're releasing today, we estimate that this would create 2.8 million jobs in 2010, 2.3 million jobs in 2011. What are those estimates based on? They're based partially on the experience with the New Jobs Tax Credit. They're also based on a large literature on how employment decisions respond in the short run to changes in the wage on the margin. What are the costs of this? Well, there are a lot of ways of parsing the cost. If you fully consider all the positive fiscal feedback effects on the economy of adding jobs, that is, the increased tax revenues that occur, the reduction in social safety net expenditures that occur, the net cost of this are roughly $5,000 per job created. So that adds to a budgetary cost of $13 billion to $14 billion a year. Now, if you don't like doing the numbers that way, you can say, gee, I don't know if I want to count on these feedback effects. The gross cost per jobs created are still under $30,000 per job, which is pretty cheap compared to the social benefits of job creation, as was referred to earlier today. That, you know, losing jobs today and long-term unemployment has significant adverse effects in the economy long-term. Creating a job is worth much more in social benefits than $30,000. Now, number of objections that have been raised that we address in the briefing paper, and I'll address briefly today. One thing you'll hear said is that a wage credit won't create jobs because there's no demand. So the idea is that all the employers are cutting back, and so why would they respond to this? There's no demand. You're not going to have jobs if there's no demand for your product. That's certainly true. What needs to be reflected is this doesn't affect all employers. If the employer without this would be cutting half their employment, this is not relevant to them. But we know from looking at the dynamics of how employers, at any one given point in time, even in the current economy, there are employers doing all kinds of things. There are employers who are contracting. There are employers who are closing. There are employers who are keeping employment the same. There are employers who are expanding. There are employers who are opening up. We are a very dynamic economy with very diverse employer experience, even in the current economy. Now, obviously, the balance now is tipped more to contraction and expansion, but even in the current economy, there are many employers who potentially would be in a position to respond to this because they, on the margin, the issue is they might be considering adding 2 jobs, and the question is whether cutting the wage on the additions by 15% would cause them to tip that to 3 jobs or 4 jobs. Or maybe they're planning on keeping things stable, they'd like to expand, they're not sure they'd have the cash flow to do this, whatever, maybe they decide to add a job or 2. And as jobs are added, one of the things that does is add the labor incomes, which tends to validate increased overall output demand. There's also some effects. There's some evidence from the 1977-78 New Jobs Tax Credit that it tended to encourage some lower prices in the retail sector, which tended to expand output demand. You know, one of the things I've heard said several places, several commentators have said, gee, the New Job Tax Credit, what a failure. It only created, out of every 3 jobs it subsidized, only 1 was actually induced by the thing. Basically, if this policy is that successful, it has a wildly high benefit-cost ratio. Because remember, you're providing a tax credit of roughly $7,000 for the average job addition. If 1 out of every 3 jobs is induced, that's a cost of $21,000. The naive estimate would be the cost is $21,000 per induced job, really cheap. When you include feedback effects and other things, it drops even further. I mean, you don't need to tip very many decisions for this policy to make a lot of sense. So you don't need to solve every employer's problem. You don't need to tip every decision. You just need to tip a sufficient number of decisions to get an effect. Second question sometimes I've heard is, wouldn't it be simpler to just lower the payroll tax rate? We took the same model we did to estimate the effect of this and looked at that. Payroll tax holidays are very expensive per job created. You know, we estimate that a full payroll tax holiday would cost over $500 billion a year. Well, you know, maybe someone wants to finance that. Basically, the cost per job created is over 20 times as great for a payroll tax holiday as it is for this job creation tax credit. Why does the cost differential there? Payroll tax holiday provides an across-the-board tax break to all employment. That ends up being very expensive. This provides a tax break for additions to employment, much cheaper. It's a little more complex. We've worked out a way of doing it we think is relatively straightforward. Employers can claim it as part of their quarterly regular tax filings. Second idea. I have 1 minute, geez. Second idea, National Mead Program. I've talked about this a lot. If you want to read more about it, I wrote up the Upjohn Institute newsletter about this. It's a revised version of a program used in Minnesota in the 1980s. It's a variant of public service employment. It's a spending program, not a tax credit. It would also apply some to private sector jobs. It would go to local workforce investment boards. They could match up disadvantaged, long-term unemployed with job opportunities in small nonprofit employers, small business. You know, the estimates are that if you ran this at an achievable scale, you could create 800,000 jobs in 2010, 1.2 million in 2011. The cost per job created are $20,000 per job. So this is more expensive than a job creation tax credit. On the other hand, it targets more of the disadvantaged. The gentleman earlier who referred to the problem of dealing with people with a criminal record. We need to think not only about how to create jobs in aggregate, but how to target some of the job creation on the disadvantaged. And a national version of the Mead program could do that. And I'll stop there.
Thank you, Timothy. Janet, you're up.
It's amazing how time flies in these panels, and it's great to see so many people. As I was introduced, I am the Director of Transportation Infrastructure for the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. I'm going to focus my remarks on infrastructure, but would be remiss if I didn't mention that the Chamber recently announced its Free Enterprise Initiative. It's American Free Enterprise, Dream Big. The point of that initiative is that we need to create and sustain over 20 million jobs over the next 10 years, 7 million approximately for those that have been lost in this recession, and then just to keep up with population growth, another 13 million jobs. It's a serious economic and long-term positive emphasis by the U.S. Chamber to talk about the fact that it is free enterprise underlying our values that have created these positions. It's those things that will help us lift people out of poverty, improve lives here and around the world. It's something we're tapping our entire membership for. And we think that it's imperative to remind people, to educate and persuade them that business isn't the bad guy. Now that's not what the official talking points they gave me say here, but I think it's a whole lot easier just to come out and say business isn't always the bad guy in this case. And so we need to make sure that as we come out of this recovery, as we work on putting more people to work in the near term, that we are not sacrificing the long-term impact and the long-term effects of the public sector and the private sector working together to recreate and to sustain those jobs. Let me talk a little bit about infrastructure, and of course you heard Ed Rendell and Rosa DeLauro talk about this at length before this panel, but the Chamber is, I think, one of those organizations that has surprised a lot of people on its stance on infrastructure. When I came to work for the Chamber about 3 years ago, we started working on reauthorization of federal highway and transit legislation. That legislation that was passed in 2005 we call SAFE-TLU, the Safe, Accountable, Flexible, Efficient Transportation Equity Act, hyphen a legacy for users, provided $286.4 billion in federal funding for highway and public transportation projects. That is a whole lot of jobs that are direct, indirect, and induced around the construction industry, around design, engineering, technology, aggregates, you name it. it really does, an infrastructure investment affects throughout the entire economy. That legislation expired on September 30th of this year. The Obama administration has said, we don't want to deal with that right now. We got other things to work on. The Senate has said, we'd like an 18-month extension of that bill. We've got other things to work on. The House has said, we need to pass the successor to Safety Loop because we need $450 billion in federal investment in highways and transit, not just, by the way, to address the major transportation needs in this country on the highway and transit side, but also because it's really important to keep people in those industries whose livelihood depends on the combination of federal, state, local, and private money and infrastructure. We need to keep them working. You know, a lot of people come to me and they say, well, we had a stimulus package, right? We had $787 billion. Isn't that enough for you people? And I said, well, $787 billion was not exactly all infrastructure spending. The Chamber actually supported that stimulus package. We wanted to see more infrastructure out of it. Tom Donahue testified to that. Only $27.5 billion of that went to highways, about $9 billion went to transit. Only $3.1 billion went to aviation money. Aviation, that money's all gone. That got put to work dealing with runways, putting asphalt and concrete on the ground. The highway money is at least 50% obligated. The transit money is 50% obligated. If there's a great success story in the stimulus, it's getting the transportation dollars out the door. But what happens when that money is gone and there's not a new long-term highway and transit bill in place? Where are those jobs going to go? So one of the things that we're very supportive of is that the entire Congress and the administration get off the dime and figure out how you're going to pay for, because I'm sure we'll talk today about deficits. This is a bill that is paid for out of people paying user fees on driving, likely more likely called the gas tax. We got to figure out how we pay for it, and we got to keep those people working. But it's not just highways and transit, which get talked about a lot. The FAA reauthorization bill, which is airports, which is runways, air traffic control. Talk about technology jobs, by the way. Migrating our air traffic control system to something that instead of being 1950s radar-based is present-day GPS-based and would create capacity in that air travel system. That bill's 2 years late because nobody can figure out what to do and get that bill passed. And we have to also face water control exports, and that's where we really have the opportunity, since 95% of the world's consumers live outside the United States, we have an opportunity to provide low-cost competitive transportation to keep those kinds of industries moving in America. And yet it takes 20 years to do a lock project. But when one of those locks on the inland waterway systems goes down, it can cost a company 2 weeks in time before that lock gets put back up. There's a lot of jobs associated with rebuilding that infrastructure, but there are also a lot of jobs associated with the efficiency of that. So the Chamber has said we need to focus on our transportation infrastructure, but it's not just that, it's also energy, broadband, and clean and drinking water. And a lot of those infrastructure elements are funded both by the public sector and the private sector. So what am I saying? First of all, we got to deal with the availability of capital for these industries. I agree with Congresswoman DeLauro and with Governor Mandel. We've got to look at all of the funding and financing options and find a way to get more money into the system. We've got to unlock the $180 billion in private capital that's ready to go into U.S. infrastructure, making sure that states and localities are open to those kinds of public-private partnerships. But we've also got to sustain public funding and grow that public funding, and that takes a willingness to talk about how you pay for those issues. One way or another, however, we have to deal with how we maintain, modernize, and expand our infrastructure. It can provide jobs for us today, but one of the reasons that the U.S. Chamber feels so strongly in infrastructure issues is that we know that our economic growth as a country is correlated with the productivity of that infrastructure. And so we're not just talking about short-term issues, we're talking about the long-term. And look, I'm getting the hook. I'm just in time.
That was very well done, Janet. And let me reassure you that you're not the only organization that is concerned about inland waterways. That's going to be a big focus of our work going forward on infrastructure, not only for the reasons you indicated, but just because it's so much more energy efficient than other alternatives. Thea Lee?
Thank you, Sherle. Good morning, everybody. It's a tremendous pleasure to be here and to have such a great audience to talk about this important issue at this extraordinary moment that we find ourselves at. I feel like we're facing enormous challenges. They are both in terms of the economic policy and in terms of the politics. And I wanted to talk about both of those because the stakes are high on both fronts. In terms of the labor market, I'm not going to go over the details again. I think everybody here has talked in very striking terms about just how abysmal the labor market picture is, whether it's the short term, the medium term, or even out several years, that we're breaking records right and left, and there's really no way, there's no slice on the labor market data that looks good. Whether you talk about the long-term unemployment, the number of job seekers to every job opening, the rise in underemployment, the fall in hours, the fall in labor force participation, and also the disparity between racial impacts and the sectoral spread of the current unemployment crisis. But I also wanted to say a couple of things that this labor market crisis comes on top of. Approximately $12 to $14 trillion evaporation of wealth between the housing market bust and the financial markets. It comes on top of healthcare and retirement security systems that would be an embarrassment in a much poorer country that are failing us. On top of 30 years of inadequate real wage growth and growing inequality. And all of these things together, as Rosa DeLauro said, will translate directly into homelessness, bankruptcy, sky-high child poverty rates, especially in communities of color, and the political consequences of trying to run for office, for re-election in November 2010, looking at the kinds of pictures and the kinds of economic pain that people will be experiencing in this country for the foreseeable future, I think is something we don't want to wake up in August of 2010 and start to think about. And so I wanted to talk about two things briefly. The urgent need for two kinds of government action, and I think a lot of folks have already talked about. There's two different issues here. One is the short-term recession and the need to get the economy out of the recession to stop the downward cycle. And the other term is the structural issues. And I don't think you can separate these two things because they are related to each other. And it goes back to a point that Leo Hendry made, quoting President Obama. We cannot rebuild this economy on the same pile of sand. And so I think we have to pay attention to the long-term and the structural issues, even as we think about the desperate and the urgent need to get out of the hole that we're in. And I'm just a word to the politicians and the political pundits in the crowd that I know it's difficult. And people talked about second stim. We don't talk about second stim. We talk about the need for a further installment on the economic recovery package. But, and I know that folks are starting to worry about the budget deficit and how high it is, and we can't possibly have more deficit spending. And I agree with Joe's points that he made earlier today. This is not the moment to fret about the budget deficit. We have very low inflation and low prospects for inflation. We have the danger of sliding into a protracted recession, if not a depression. We should not be worrying about that. And for the politicians, what I would say is we can either find the political will now to address the jobs crisis that we're facing, or you will face the political consequences a year from now. And that's not going to be easy to deal with. And the point is that it's not even just November 2010. It's 2011, it's 2012, it's 2013, and 2014 that we're thinking about as well. And that's why I think, even as we talk about the short term, it may even be that we need to take our definition of short term, it's not 1 or 2 years. I think the short term is now 3 or 4 years, because that is the magnitude of the economic crisis that we are facing. And so I think a lot of people have put on the table a lot of very good ideas in terms of the short-term stimulus, and I would agree with most of them, and I think it's really just a question of how do you get the most bang for every dollar. We know we're not going to have a lot of extra dollars to play with, and so whatever kind of economic recovery installment we get, we're going to have to make it count. I would put state and local spending very high at the top of the list, partly because it's quick, it's urgently needed, and the state and local governments not only will be faced with, I think it's a projected shortfall of about $578 billion in their budgets through the year 2012. But when they start to lay off, they lay off in ways that are particularly painful to those at the bottom of the economic rung. They lay off teachers and firefighters and police, and they cut back on things like unemployment and food stamps and Medicaid, things that are desperately needed, particularly in times of economic downturn. So I think it's important. And one of the political points folks have made about state and local spending is that it's not as politically sexy as some other kinds of spending, because usually what you're doing is preventing a layoff from occurring, so it's not as easy to trot out the employed worker from the state and local. But it is important nonetheless, and I think there are a lot of teachers that are facing smaller classroom sizes or taught summer school this year or didn't get laid off because of the economic recovery spending that already happened. And I think the other point about the state and local is that we need to make sure, we need to build in counter-cyclical relief for state and local governments. Automatic stabilizers and programs like Medicaid, so that they're triggers to pump additional aid to state and local governments when the economy weakens. I totally agree with Janet. It's nice to be on a panel with somebody from the Chamber of Commerce with whom I actually have something in common on the need for infrastructure spending, and I also appreciated the remarks earlier of Governor Mandel and Congressman DeLauro. The infrastructure spending is important. I actually want to talk about that in the next piece, the structural reform, because I think that one of the things that's been confusing about the infrastructure discussion in the context of the recovery bill is this narrow focus of trying to find infrastructure projects that are only 2 years long and that can be done tomorrow. And we need those kinds of things. That's a good kind of spending to do for the economic recovery, but we also desperately need longer time horizon infrastructure spending, 5 to 10 years infrastructure spending. We have enormous voids and deficits in infrastructure, and we should not limit ourselves in the infrastructure fund thinking to short-term stimulus. The other point in terms of short-term is the credit crunch, and that even though we gave $700 billion to the banks a few months ago, it seems like just a few months ago, we're still hearing all the time from people out in the field, particularly small manufacturers and small businesses, they can't get credit, even if they have customers, even if they have a business they want to conduct. And I think one of the things we ought to consider is whether we can free up some of the remaining TARP funds and whether the government can get that money out more directly than handing it over to the banks and sitting around waiting for them to lend it out when they are not always doing that with the money. So those are the basic short-term pieces. And I just wanted to say a little bit about the structural reform. That one of the arguments that is made sometimes is that, and I hear this a lot in my job, in this economy, we can't afford to do health care. In this economy, we can't afford to have a minimum wage increase. In this economy, we can't afford to have stronger unions because the economy is really bad and we can't afford to do financial reform. I would actually turn that upside down on its head and say, how the hell do you think we got into this economy in the first place? It is because we systematically destroyed workers' bargaining power. We systematically put in place a deregulatory, privatizing, wrong kind of globalization that cut out government actions, that pulled the rug out from underneath average working people, that made it virtually impossible for workers to gain income as their productivity rose. And so we created a really dysfunctional, a truly dysfunctional economy. We need to rebuild that from the bottom up, or we're going to end up just right where we started again, even in 2 or 3 or 5 years. And the last two recoveries, if you recall, were jobless recoveries also, and particularly the last one. And after 2001 recession, we had a recovery for most of the 2000s that was a pathetic recovery. We ended that recovery with median incomes lower than where they started, with a pretty anemic job growth, with wages lower than where they started, with poverty higher than where it started. What the heck kind of an economy is that doesn't actually deliver to working people? And so I would start with 3 major imbalances in the economy. The imbalance between workers and employers. We need labor law reform, the Employee Free Choice Act, to figure out how workers can bargain for their fair share of the wealth that they create and not have to borrow into the middle class anymore. On trade policy, we talked about this a little bit today, but I think it's also important that the United States government cannot continue to function in the global economy by borrowing 5 to 6 to 7% of GDP every year from the rest of the world. We have to figure out how we are going to be able to bring our current account closer into equilibrium. That is going to require a different kind of trade policy, a different kind of strategy, addressing currency manipulation, enforcing our trade laws, but also not having a mindless rhetoric on a strong dollar. I'm not even sure what that means and but it's not compatible with the idea that we need to rebalance our external account. And finally, we need to regulate the financial sector so we can bring some balance back between the real economy and the financial sector. And so those 3 things, I think, are the imbalances that we need to fix, and we need to make those long-term investments in infrastructure that will, in fact, provide the foundation for the United States to be a more competitive, successful player in the global economy. Thank you so much, and I look forward to the rest of the panelists and your questions.
Thank you, Thea. We're moving from, as you noticed, from obvious short-term proposals, solutions, to ones that mix the short-term and long-term structural issues. And now we're going to continue on further into the long-term and structural with Michael Mandel.
First, I want to thank the New America Foundation for putting on this event. I think this is a fantastically important topic at this point. I also want to thank the audience for being here. I want to extend the point that Lenny and Leo made earlier, that the job crisis predates the bust. And this really changes the way that we think about the short-term and the long-term response. I'm going to make 3 data points, really. First, take a look at this. The private sector jobs peaked in December 2007. The previous peak was December 2000. If you look at what happened over those 7 years of a so-called boom, what happened is that the private education health sector accounted for 85% of net new job creation over this boom. Now, this sector, of course, is heavily government supported, both directly and indirectly. So from my point of view, I look at that 7 years, that business cycle, and what I see there is actually a suppressed bust. So we didn't go from boom to bust. We went from a suppressed bust to an explicit bust. Second, if I focus down on what we would call our most innovative industries, which is biotech, pharma, internet publishing, and websites, web search, which includes a lot of bold-faced companies, includes Google, Yahoo, Amgen, Pfizer, all these great companies, and you look at what the job creation was in those industries over this 7-year stretch that ran from one peak to the next. Do you know how many jobs these leading edge industries created in 7 years? 4,000. 4,000, okay? To me, this is a very scary number because it points to a deep dysfunctionality. The third data point, incidentally, if anybody's interested, these numbers will go up on my blog, Economics Unbound, either tonight or tomorrow morning, depending on what time I get home tonight. Okay? The third data point, which is not quite a jobs point, but I think very related, is that if you look at the wages, the real wages of young college grads, that is people who have a BA and not an advanced degree, what you look from 2000 to 2008, what you see is that the wages of these people went down by 11% over this period. So what you had is and it was pretty much continuous. There's a couple of little blips up along the way, but it's a pretty continuous fall. So you have as a situation where even I consider these young graduates to be the canary in the coal mine. You cannot have a well-functioning global economy for the U.S. if these people are doing bad, because in fact you have nothing to offer the people that are. You can't make the case about higher level of education actually benefiting you if these people are having falling real wages. And there's a great graph you can draw that shows falling real wages at the same time that the real cost of college is soaring. That's not a good thing. So, when I took a step back and I said, okay, this predates the bust, what was going on here, and it really is a combination of trade and innovation. And let me just sort of say is that I came to this conclusion very unwillingly. If people have read my work over the years, I've always been a very pro-innovation and sort of kind of moderately pro-free trade. But here's the problem right now, is that you look at the data and it turns out that the government data severely underestimates the impact of trade. What we have is a failure of statistics. In fact, this is going to be a theme going forward. Leo picked up on this earlier with the unemployment rate. If you look at what's going on in the trade statistics and you dig deep into this, and there's a conference that's being put on by a colleague of Tim, Sue Hausman, in a couple of weeks that's going to get at this. Turns out the data is just I don't want to use it. It's just bad, okay? And let me give you an example. It's an economics term. Yucky is an economic term. if you look at the import penetration ratio in computers as calculated by the Bureau of Economic Statistics, it turns out that according to their numbers, import penetration of computers fell in half between 1998 and 2008. Now, is this the real world we live in, or what? Okay, that makes no sense at all. Okay. You know, it's also going to turn out, and that we're going to get this good GDP number, quote unquote, good GDP number in a couple weeks. All right. At the same time that there's layoffs, it turns out, and I've written about this in the past, GDP does not count intangible investments such as R&D, product development, and design. So to the extent that we are laying off engineers, to the extent we're laying off scientists, to the extent that we're laying off people, saying we're laying off teachers, okay, that negative impact on our output is actually not being counted in as GDP. So this GDP is artificially, we're going to have an artificially positive number because we're not taking into account some of the things that we should have. So one issue is bad data in trade. The second issue, and this is a lack of innovation over the last 10 years. And I know this is a weird thing when I talk to people about this, they sort of step back, how could this be? But if you look at the things that we were supposed to have online in 1998, things like gene therapy, things like nanotech, fuel cells, and so forth, there's a lot of areas where we've made progress in a scientific way, but we haven't made progress in terms of economic payoffs that would have generated jobs. So we've got a trade problem, we've got an innovation problem, and I really hate to sort of say this, but they're both pretty horrible. What this means when we get to the sort of the short-term stimulus like Tim was talking about, we are running uphill. Okay? It makes these things less effective than they could be. So I have sort of 3 suggestions at this point that sort of doesn't take away from anything that anybody else on the panel has said, but kind of an add-on. One is when we talk about job stimulus, we should think about at least making sure that it goes to new industries as well as old industries. The problem with Tim's proposal is that it gives no job credits. Maybe it does to sort of new startups.
Sure.
Does it?
Yeah.
People that didn't exist before?
Yep.
Okay, well maybe, that's good. I would lean it even more towards the startups. Second, and this goes to the point that people are making about the educational system, one thing that we need to keep supporting is early childhood investment, where we are severely underinvested. And the third thing is, I can't believe that I'm sort of saying this, is that we've got, even after this deep, deep downturn, we still have a substantial non-oil trade deficit, okay? I'm not going to give any specific proposals here, but we have to do something about it. And I guess my feeling is this, is that if you've got frostbite, you don't stay out in the cold. If you've got a debt and jobs crisis, you don't keep borrowing from overseas. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Now, Michael Lind.
Thank you. I'm in the unenviable position of being between you and lunch. And also being the last panelist in a long day, so I'll be very brief. The present economic crisis, the worst since the Great Depression, has resulted from the convergence of 3 different events. The first is a recession. The second is the bursting of an asset bubble, or perhaps 2 asset bubbles in a row. The third is the continuing economic and social transition associated with the third industrial revolution, which is being driven by information technology. In thinking about policies to reduce unemployment, we need to consider the consequences of the asset bubble and long-term trends in the structure of the economy and employment. The oath of Hippocrates is still taken by medical doctors. It's known as a Freudian slip. Do no harm. In the aftermath of the bubble economy, doing no harm means that public policy should not only avoid inflating new asset bubbles, but also put no obstacles in the way of correcting the misallocations of labor created by the bubble economy. In the last decade, the last generation, the previous tech bubble, the financial, insurance, and real estate or FIRE sectors swelled far out of proportion to what should have been its size in a healthy, productive economy. Fueled by the vast wealth that was concentrated in the FIRE sector and spent on conspicuous consumption, as well as by borrowing on the part of middle-class Americans, the construction and luxury service sectors underwent extreme growth as well. Arguably, this represented a massive misallocation of resources, both labor and capital, that might have gone into productive activity, including production for export, and also the provision of public goods like infrastructure and of merit goods like health care and education. In adopting policies to reduce unemployment over the long term, we should seek to ensure that those policies encourage a shift of labor out of these overgrown sectors, or at least do not prevent such a shift. At the same time, we need to think about long-term structural trends in the pattern of employment. Here the object would be to go with the flow if we think that the flow is in the right direction for our economy. A perhaps apocryphal story has the foreman of Ted Turner's Ranch being asked, "How do you herd buffalo?" The answer is, first you find out where the buffalo want to go. If the goal of public policy is to reduce unemployment, we ought to ask where the jobs of tomorrow want to be created. Now, it is sometimes said that we are in the midst of a transition from an industrial society to a post-industrial society, but that's a mistake. When it comes to overall employment, the transition from an industrial society to a post-industrial society took place half a century ago. Daniel Bell was writing about the post-industrial society taking place in the 1950s and 1960s. There have been three major transitions, each associated with a particular wave of industrial technology. The first industrial revolution, associated with steam power, saw a shift of labor from agriculture to factory labor. The second industrial revolution, associated with electricity and automobiles, saw a shift of labor from the factory to the office in the middle of the 20th century. In the second half of the 20th century, the routine clerical office worker had become the norm rather than the factory worker. The third industrial revolution, associated with information technology today, is eliminating many routine office jobs, partly by allowing them to be offshored, but mainly by automating them. In the last generation, entire occupations, ranging from card punch operators to typists, have been replaced by intelligent machines. Anything that a computer can do, eventually a computer will do. The jobs of tomorrow are those that cannot be automated, either because they require a high degree of creativity and skill, or because they rely on the human touch in face-to-face interactions. The latter are sometimes called proximity services, and they include the fastest growing occupations at the moment, healthcare and education, about which Michael Mandel has written very brilliantly. I'll conclude just by looking at the healthcare sector. Most job growth in the last decade has been concentrated in three sectors: healthcare, education, and government, mostly state and local government. On October 2nd, the Bureau of Labor Statistics released jobs data for September. During September, employment declined in construction, manufacturing, retail services, and government. But the health sector added 19,000 jobs last month, with 15,000 of them being in ambulatory healthcare services, defined as non-emergency medical services. Since the recession began, healthcare has added 559,000 jobs. Even more remarkable, the average monthly gain of 22,000 jobs during 2009 has been only slightly lower than the average increase of 30,000 jobs a month in 2008, before the recession. The rise of the healthcare sector is illustrated by a couple of statistics. 14 out of the 20 fastest growing jobs will be related to healthcare, led by the single fastest growing occupations, home health aides and registered nurses. These two jobs are also found among the fastest growing job categories and among the occupations with the largest overall job openings in the years ahead. Now, the rise of the healthcare sector, and arguably of similar quality of life sectors based on proximity services, flies in the face of two popular predictions about the jobs of the future. In the 1990s, advocates of the new economy argued that the jobs of the future were what former Labor Secretary Robert Wright called symbolic analyst jobs. However, the tech jobs that are expected to grow most rapidly are those of office tech specialists, who are typically not the highest paid or most prestigious members of most firms. Many hope that green-collar jobs can be the jobs of the future. But green jobs, on closer inspection, mostly turn out to be manufacturing jobs that can be offshored like other manufacturing jobs, or low-wage, low-skill construction jobs, like weatherization. Another myth of recent years has been that the so-called jobs of the future required every American to get a 4-year college education. In reality, according to the Council of Economic Advisors, which published a paper on this recently, The categories with some education required beyond high school are growing faster than those not requiring post-secondary schooling. The growth is not solely among occupations requiring bachelor's degrees. Occupations that require only an associate's degree or a post-secondary vocational award are actually projected to grow slightly faster than occupations requiring a bachelor's degree or more. Because of this, the appropriate public policy response might be not to send more Americans to expensive four-year colleges, particularly if that means crippling burdens of personal debt in the form of student loans, but rather to expand the vocational training provided by the community college system. Rebalancing the global economy will require the U.S. to rebuild some of its export capacity, even as chronic surplus countries like China, Japan, and Germany shift to greater demand-driven growth. Having said this, global overcapacity in industries like automobiles will impose some constraints on how much American manufacturing can be revived, even in the best circumstances. And productivity growth will continue to replace labor with technology in manufacturing both in the U.S. and abroad. We need to encourage high-value added manufacturing in the U.S., but we should recognize that high-tech manufacturing, like high-tech agriculture, will provide relatively few jobs as it becomes increasingly productive. I'll end on a somewhat positive note. There are at least some economists who see this shift towards public goods and towards service sector jobs as being something that is not necessarily bad. Productivity growth in agriculture, construction, and manufacturing has greatly reduced the cost of food, shelter, and appliances. In the U.S. and similar societies, the income that this liberates tends to be used on quality of life goods, of which healthcare is the most important, but education is also part of it. There are diminishing returns to the utility of a second or third or a fourth car or flat screen TV, but not necessarily to increased investment in health. So I think we should keep that in mind, that as we devise programs to deal with the immediate crisis, which may last for several years, as we've heard, we should bear in mind that a lot of jobs and a lot of sectors are not coming back. And we should have an image in our mind of the kind of employment structure that will result in the rest of this century. That's where the buffalo are going. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. We now have 20 to 25 minutes for questions, and we'll follow the rules that were laid down by Steve Call and Steve Clemens. I've already acknowledged Leo Hendry, who will sort of connect the first panel to the last panel.
My question is for Ms. Kavinoky. I understand, or at least I think I understand, your alleged enthusiasm for infrastructure investment. I find it in deep conflict with your outspoken criticism of anything that approaches Buy American or Buy Domestic, particularly in light of the May decision out of China that 100% of government purchases, both federal and provincial in China, henceforth 100% is Buy Chinese. Yet Tom Donahue is the most outspoken opponent of anything approaching Buy Domestic or Buy American on our infrastructure investments here in the U.S. It's an amazing conflict. Maybe you could elaborate.
You know, I knew that being the chamber person at this conference would be really, really interesting today. But you ask a very good and legitimate question. First of all, let me assure you that my personal enthusiasm for infrastructure is beyond what any of you could possibly imagine, as evidenced by the fact that my husband now knows more about this topic than anybody else besides me, I think. You are right. The chamber is and will continue to be an outspoken opponent of Buy America, and that's because we fundamentally believe we're living in a global economy. We've got companies that operate globally. Supply chains are not limited to the United States. It's hard to, yes, it is hard in some respects with regard to particular commodities to say, no, okay, this hasn't hurt particular industries hasn't gone away. But the reality is you're dealing with a free trade system that still has produced, I think, growth for us. And we've had a lot of discussion here, and we'll continue to have discussion about the benefits of trade, but certainly the 40 countries that we have FTAs with, free trade agreements, The 17 we have bilateral investment agreements with are ones with which we have a trade surplus, with the exception, of course, of Canada and Mexico on the oil side of things, but that's more of a function of geology than it is anything else. So we still fundamentally believe that the best way to produce value and for companies to produce value is to be able to source products globally and bring them here to the United States.
Can you answer it in the specific context of China? 100% buy China policy as of May 16th, 100%, and yet continued resistance out of the chamber and no comment in opposition to that action.
Can I answer that question? Well, just because the Chinese are doing it doesn't mean it's what we need to be doing. We have said, and we said in the stimulus package, Buy America was not a good idea. It could result in significant trade problems for us. But again, I guess my best answer for you is just because the Chinese are doing it doesn't mean it's the right thing for us to do.
Well, I think this may be only the opening of a longer conversation about this issue. There's a series of hands right in that area back there.
Yes, I'm Barry Stern with the Haberman Educational Foundation. For the point of simplicity, let's say there's 85 million jobs in this country and 15 million people don't have them. Back in the 80s, late 70s, we started with things like work sharing, job sharing, work sharing unemployment insurance. I think that 15 or 20 states have. I'm not sure the extent to which Americans would buy into the idea of trading in income earning work time to get more free time. But is this a possibility of expanding this notion of all the things we're talking about, tax credits and various job creation policies, infrastructure? What about something we tried and it seems to be used quite a bit now from the 1980s, that being work sharing and job sharing?
Anyone want to weigh in? Timothy.
This isn't exactly my area, but I should mention my colleague Sue Howes with the Upjohn Institute has already mentioned has some ideas for extending unemployment insurance for involuntary part-time work. And I think that might address your concern to some degree that a lot of European countries do this, and it allows perhaps for more equitable sharing of the burden of a downturn across various employees in a company. If the current unemployment insurance system tends to discourage when the demand for labor is lower from sharing the reduced work hours among the workforce due to the way it's structured. And there are some models from Europe that could be used to do better than that. And that's in, I think, the latest July 2009 issue of the Upjohn Institute newsletter. Sue Howden discusses that.
This gentleman here. Yes.
Mark Gruenberg from Press Associates News Service. Question for the panel. Mr. Lind raised in his closing remarks something that hadn't been addressed. We have a twofold jobs problem. One is the gross problem of creating these millions of new jobs, the 20 million or so that we need for the next decade. But the other is the what type, where he pointed out that the growth areas are the low wage areas, the home health care aides, the tech specialists, things like that. It's great to create new jobs, but if they're all hamburger flippers at McDonald's, we've got a problem. Comment?
The two Michaels, do you want to weigh?
Let me give a quick comment. One is, if you look at healthcare jobs, healthcare has the full distribution of jobs from the top to the bottom. Okay, so if in fact healthcare jobs are being generated, they actually don't. They're not weighted towards low wage jobs. The other thing that I mentioned was that the fall in real wages for people, high wage jobs, and the lack of creation of jobs in innovative industries is actually just a separate problem unto itself that we really have to think about. We may have to absorb, to get out of this, a fall in our living standards, because the implication of a falling dollar, is that you end up with more expensive imports, and you have a lower standard of living, and certainly in the short run, to get back on track. So this is something that we may have to grapple with.
Michael.
4 out of 5 jobs in the U.S. are in the non-traded domestic service sector. Now, McKinsey and Alan Blinder and various other analysts, have said that this can go up somewhat, but it's not going to go up, that radically. Now, what this means is that when employers say that wages have to be low because we can't compete in a global environment, that's true in the tradable goods sector, arguably. At least you can make that case that labor costs matter. Most people in this country already work in jobs that cannot be outsourced. They have to be performed on U.S. soil by people who are here, be they citizens or immigrants. And that means it's really a question of leverage and frankly, of power. If you look at a lot of these jobs that we consider low-wage, pathetic jobs in the U.S., like let's say home health aides, in countries where the service sector is unionized, unlike in the United States, these are middle-class jobs. It means that the costs are higher, for some of the upper middle-class consumers. Child care can be provided by illegal immigrant nannies who are paid below the minimum wage, or it can be provided, by well-paid middle-class people, either privately or publicly. And so I think the first thing we have to get through our minds is that as a result of globalization, to the extent that you allow it to take place, that actually means more jobs are in the non-traded sector, not fewer, simply because the ones that are going to go have gone, and the ones that remain, there's leverage. Now, you need a traded sector that is very innovative and very dynamic for your economy as a whole. If you look at, for example, the Scandinavian countries, where they've had very egalitarian societies, they've also done very well in international trade. And in investment in technology. So I'm not saying that you can have a service sector without a dynamic traded sector, but you need to have both in this emerging system that we're having.
Yes. Yes. Well, we'll get the other gentleman next time. But no, go ahead.
All right. I'm Sandy.
Don't give up the microphone when you have it.
That'd be a mistake.
But use it very, very wisely.
Oh, I will, trust me. I'm Sandy Ginsberg with the Committee for Education Funding, and my question is for Michael Mandel. What education policies would you propose to close the job deficit?
Well, at this point, what I would do is I would start at every level. Okay, from the pre-K on the way up. The first thing that I'd like to do is I'd like to make sure what we had this year in September was the first year-over-year decline in educational employment when enrollments were rising, okay, on record. So that there was a couple of years in the late 70s and early 80s when educational employment went down, but enrollments were collapsing at that point, so it was not the same thing. You can't have this. It doesn't make any sense. There's a lot of things in this economy that people can agree and disagree can be done better or worse, but having your educational employment falling in the middle of a recession, in the middle of a time when we need better human capital, at a time when enrollments are rising, is just kind of nuts, right? There's certain economic policies that are just nuts, and this is one of them. I really appreciate that the stimulus package had a lot of money for education, but I would put in more at this point to at least keep the jobs moving up with enrollment. So that's kind of my short answer.
Yes, the other gentleman.
I'm Arnie Packer, ex of Johns Hopkins. When you talk about, this is I guess to Michael Lind, since he used the idea of the buffalo being shepherded where they want to go. When you think about the jobs that are growing, don't you think that the emphasis on high-level math and science for all students is just contrary to the needs of the jobs, especially those that are face-to-face and provide personal services in education and health particularly?
That's a very good question. A study done for the Princeton Educational Testing Service recently said that between now and 2050, probably no more than 30% of jobs expected to be created, and this was before the crisis, but in long-term trends, would require a bachelor's degree. Now, does that mean you don't want, basic STEM education up to a certain point for everyone? Certainly you do. But the idea that everyone, in order to compete in the 21st century, has to have calculus and trigonometry and so on, there's a point at which you have some kind of tracking, voluntarily, and some people will go into those fields. Most will not need them. And I just think it's good that you raised that point, because education can be used as an alibi for policies of denying increases in the minimum wage for inflation, of battling unionization, and so on, to say, oh, well, these people who actually are not participating in economic growth because their unions have been crushed, or because the Congress has allowed the minimum wage to be eaten away by inflation, to say, oh, see, they can't compete in the global economy because of their skills. That may be true of a few engineers and scientists. It's not true of janitors. It's not true of home health aides.
Can I add one point to this? We're making a bet in an uncertain future right now. You can imagine a situation where math and science skills globally actually you have overcapacity in them. They become a commodity because of other countries that have stressed them so much. Or you can imagine a world in which technology advances in such a way that everybody needs to have them in order to function. I'm concerned at this point about economic and financial literacy. We have a lot of people just on adding and subtracting and understanding of credit level that are so behind the curve that it's actually turned into an economic liability, right? And so from that point of view, I said you have to go up the curve on that. Past that point, how far you go, you're making a bet on the future.
Joe Gagnon.
Thank you, Joe Gagnon, Peterson Institute. I had a question for Janet and maybe Thea, but so you mentioned that we have a long-term need for infrastructure spending, and I agree. But one of the things that's gotten us into trouble in the past is bursts of spending that go on beyond the recovery period and actually make the boom worse and give us more of a cycle. And so you might want to separate two types of projects out and have one type that's sort of funded by some tax or revenue stream that can make it permanent, and then the other thing that's countercyclical. How much, A, would you agree with that, and B, how much do you think there is the capacity to usefully use in the short term? I mean, if you did want to limit yourself to stuff that was fighting the recession, projects that could start soon and end soon, how much are we talking?
I can start with that. Let me answer your second question first, which is how much can we continue to use these really short-term projects? And what we're hearing, and I'll speak on the highway side in particular, which is where most of that stimulus money went, the backlog is going away. The backlog of some of the real able to do extremely short-term things are going away. There is still a tremendous need for an ongoing, sustained investment in maintaining, modernizing, and expanding infrastructure. There were two commissions that looked specifically at highways, transit, and rail. And they said we need $225 billion a year every year for the next 20 years just to sort of keep us going where we are today. That's a lot of potential investment. Our problem is when we come up to September 30th, 2009, and we have a political problem that Congress and the administration are in denial about the fact that we need to reauthorize legislation, and by the way, we have to talk about paying for it as well. There are many organizations, including mine, a coalition that I lead with business, labor, the construction industry, who have been working on and talking about this in advance of that for years, but it's always an inconvenient discussion to have when it's time to have a conversation to pay for it. We have had, on the highway and transit side, since 1956, for highways in particular, an ongoing source of continual funding. It happens to be that we've gotten to the point where we've got to figure out how we adjust that. We also, I think, have to discuss the ability to sustain public funding for other kinds of infrastructure, as well as to continue to spur investments in things like water, wastewater, broadband, and energy. But you're right, getting into a boom and bust cycle. If you look at the REMI data, the Regional Economic Modeling data, what you'll see is you do an infrastructure improvement, You see the immediate industries have a boom in employment, then it drops off. It's a very clear signal you've got to keep that going.
Thea, and then we're closing after Thea's come.
Okay, great. Well, Joe, I do agree with you. You have to make a distinction between the two different kinds of infrastructure spending, and that the short-term stimulus is the part that shouldn't be paid for, and the longer-term public investment that's needed in infrastructure does need to have a dedicated source of funding, and it could be a lot of different things. I mean, we've talked about a financial transactions tax, and President Obama actually talked about it on the campaign trail as well, a financial stability fee, I think he called it. There are other things, and I think Leo mentioned a couple of them in his talks, but it's true that we have to sort of figure out what the sustainable funding is. I wanted to say 2 words on Buy America, just to say that it's true, obviously, as Janet said, that we live in a global economy, but it's also true that we live in a global economy where other governments take very specific, aggressive, sometimes mercantilist actions to protect their own markets, to gain market share, and in fact to shape comparative advantage. And I think one of the things that's wrong with the way that this sort of short-term free trade way that we look at the world is that we take comparative advantage as a given. And of course, when a government invests, for example, in technology or in infrastructure, they are changing the path of comparative advantage. And the U.S. government has done far too little. I think that the U.S. government has taken an attitude that so long as our companies are making money today, we don't really care what the future trajectory looks like. We've talked about education, we've talked about technology. I think all of those things are ways in which we need a different mindset in this country that we need to be able to do. And Buy America is a crucial piece of that for things like environmental technology. We need to keep that advantage here in the United States.
Tim, you're going to have to keep it short because the tall man has
15 seconds.
Stood up.
What this infrastructure discussion illustrates is if you really want to create jobs in 2010, some type of tax policy has to be part of the mix. Then the question is, what is the most bang for the buck? And I would argue that something focused on job creation would do that.
A last-minute appeal for his idea, and I turn it over to Steve Clemens, who informs me that Jared Bernstein is now arrived.
Thank you. Thank you. Please give a round of applause to Sherle Schwenninger, Bartik, Janet Kavinoky, Thea Lee, Michael Mandel, and Michael Lynn, an outstanding ideas-generating forum. Now, let me tell you.